what happens when a fund is created in the middle of the biggest public health crisis in the century. It collects thousands of crores from ordinary Indians and corporations. Also is chaired by the Prime Minister and is managed by the 3 union ministers. It can also receive foreign donations and yet is not treated as a government fund for several important legal purposes. This is the unusual story of a PM Cares fund. And this week, the fund has once again entered the headlines.
In fact, Pawan Khera of the Congress Party has now reacted. Why is only 0.01% of this available fund been utilized? Even as natural calamities devastate communities across the country, where is this money going? Why is it sitting idle? Is a question that Pawan Khera has now asked.
हम लोग ये भी मांग करते हैं कि पीएम केयर्स का ऑडिट हो जाए पिछले 3 साल का. जो प्राइम मिनिस्टर्स नेशनल रिलीफ फंड है उसका भी जरा बता दीजिए, ब्यौरा दे दीजिए.
The latest audited statements of the PM Cares Fund for the year 24-25 and the previous financial years have been made public on the website.
Newly available audited financial statements show that financial year 2024-2025 PM Cares had a closing balance of roughly 8,453 crores. Again, 8,453 crores. Its total income was reported at around 1,280 crores and donations during the year were around 480 crores. But here's the bigger question. Why does a fund created for emergencies continue to accumulate thousands of crores year after the original emergency has passed? And more importantly, how transparent should a fund be when it is private in a legal forum but public in its purpose, leadership and national symbolism? To understand that, we have to go back to March 2020. Now, March 2020, India enters a crisis. On 27th March 2020, at the height of COVID-19 crisis, the Prime Minister's Citizen Assistance and Relief in Emergency Situations Fund, or PM Cares Fund, was registered as a public charitable trust under the Registration Act of 1908. Its stated purpose was broad: to deal with public health emergencies, natural or man-made calamities, disasters, and other distress situations. The Prime Minister became its ex officio chairperson. The Minister of Defence, Home Affairs and Finance became ex officio trustees. And unlike a normal government budget, PM Cares would not receive a budgetary support. It would rely on voluntary contributions. The government's argument was very simple. India needed a flexible emergency fund that could mobilize money rapidly without waiting for the normal budgetary procedure. And the response was actually very enormous. Now, in the first financial year itself, PM Cares received an extraordinary amount of money from the country and abroad. The official data shows that the total receipts in 2020-2021 were about 10,990 crores. Massive. That included donations and other inflows. Now, the fund subsequently received around 9,132 crores in 2021-2022 and about 6,723 crores in 2022-2023 when the official website's corpus table is considered. These data are taken from that. Now, the detailed 2022-2023 accounts show an approximately 912 crores in the contribution during that year, including 909.6 crores in the voluntary domestic contribution and 2.57 crores in foreign contributions. Now, the numbers demonstrate something remarkable. Even after India's immediate COVID emergency had subsided, people and institutions were still putting money into PM Cares. And this is where the first major question emerges. Why PM Cares when India already had NDRF and PMNRF? And this is probably the most important question. India already had a National Disaster Response Fund, or NDRF as you call it, under the Disaster Management Act of 2005. And India also had the Prime Minister's National Relief Fund, PMNRF, which was established much earlier. So why create another fund? Because these funds are legally and institutionally different. The NDRF is a statutory fund under the Disaster Management Act. It operates within a government's framework and subject to the statutory audit mechanism of the Comptroller and Auditor General. Now, PM Cares, on the other hand, is a public charitable trust. Its money comes from voluntary contributions and its objectives are broader than the statutory disaster response framework. The Supreme Court explicitly recognized this distinction in 2020. A petition had asked the court to transfer PM Cares money into NDRF. The court refused. It said that the two were very different funds with different objectives and purposes. So legally, Initially, the existence of PM CARES was not itself found to be impermissible, but the judgment also highlighted the central distinction that would define the controversy. NDRF is a statutory public fund. PM CARES is a charitable trust, and that difference has enormous consequences for accountability. Yes, enormous consequences for accountability. Let's take a very common claim. PM CARES isn't audited. This is what you hear in the news as well, but that's incorrect. It is audited, but the most precise question is, who audits it? PM CARES says its accounts are audited by an independent chartered accountant appointed by its trustees. Its official FAQ says SARC and associates were appointed as auditors for 3 years. The Comptroller and Auditor General of India does not audit PM CARES in the same manner as statutory government funds such as the NDRF is audited by the CAG, and this distinction was explicitly discussed by the Honorable Supreme Court of India in 2020. The court noted that NDRF statutory framework provides for a CAG audit, whereas PM CARES, being a public charitable trust, was not subject to that mechanism. So PM CARES is audited, of course, but PM CARES is not CAG audited in the way a statutory government fund is. That distinction is very, very essential. So from now onwards, if you read and if you hear PM CARES is not an audited fund, the answer is no. It is audited, but by some chartered accountant or CA association or CA consultancy firm. Now we reach the second major controversy. Can you file an RTI and demand information directly from PM CARES? The government's position has been PM CARES is not a public authority under Section 2H of the RTI Act. The Central Information Commission has repeatedly recorded that position while noting that the question of whether PM CARES falls within the RTI framework has been litigated before the Delhi High Court itself. This creates an unusual situation. See, it's a very important thing. The fund is chaired by the Prime Minister. 3 union ministers are the ex-officio trustees. Its official website uses a government domain. Its public-facing identity is closely associated with the office of the Honorable Prime Minister of India. Yet legally, it maintains that it is a separate charitable trust and not a public authority under the RTI Act, Right to Information Act. And this is where the transparency debates becomes much larger than the PM CARES itself. And here's the interesting constitutional question. Suppose I donate 10,000 rupees to PM CARES. Now that is a private money. The government doesn't put 10,000 rupees from the consolidated fund into the account. The PM CARES website explicitly says it receives no budgetary support and no government money. So the government can make a legitimate argument. This isn't taxpayers funded government expenditure. But then critics make a different argument. They say, look at the structure. That's all. The Prime Minister chairs it, union ministers administer it, government machinery is closely associated with it. Donations received 100% tax deduction under Section 80G. So there's 100% tax deduction as well given to the donations under the PM CARES under Section 80G, and corporate contributions can qualify as CSR expenditure, corporate social responsibility expenditure. So although the money may originate privately, the institution has a distinctly public character, and that raises a fundamental democratic question. Should the level of transparency depend only on where the money comes from, or also on the public power and public trust associated with the institution? From where the transparency should emerge? That's the question. And there is another unusual feature which you must notice. PM CARES is exempt from the operation of Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, FCRA 2010. This is consistent with the treatment of PMNRF, which has also accepted foreign contributions as a public trust. Again, this is not automatically evidence of wrongdoing. Again, I'm saying this, but it creates an interesting policy question. India has an elaborate FCRA regime regulating foreign contributions to NGOs because the government considers foreign money capable of influencing domestic affairs. Yet PM CARES itself enjoys a FCRA exemption. The question becomes, if foreign funding requires a stricter transparency when it goes to an NGO, shouldn't there be at least equally strong transparency when it goes into a fund chaired by directly the Honorable Prime Minister of India? This is the question of institutional consistency. It's not an allegation of misuse. Again, it's a question of institutional consistency. Now let's be very fair. PM CARES did not simply collect money and do nothing. During COVID, COVID, it financed or supported several interventions. These included ventilators, medical infrastructure, oxygen-related equipments, vaccination-related expenditure, and support under the PM Cares for Children framework as well. For example, the government announced that PM Cares would contribute towards the COVID vaccination program. The fund also supported procurement of oxygen concentrators and other medical equipments during the emergency. But implementation wasn't always perfect. There were reports from states about difficulties in using some ventilators supplied through the PM Cares program. For example, Rajasthan reported substantial problems with the portion of the ventilators it received. This illustrates another important principle. Spending money is not the same as achieving outcomes. An emergency fund should ultimately be judged not merely by how much was spent, because anyone can spend how much money they want, but by what did that expenditure achieve in quality. That is what should matter. And now we arrive at the most interesting part. COVID is no longer the emergency that it was in 2020. Yet PM Cares remained, and its mandate isn't limited to pandemics. Its trust deed allows it to respond to a wide range of emergencies and distress situations. That means maintaining a large reserve is not inherently irrational, that is for sure. In fact, emergency funds are supposed to have money available before the next disaster occurs. Imagine tomorrow India faces a massive earthquake or a catastrophic cyclone or another public health emergency or some other national crisis. Having a large reserve could allow immediate action in our country. So large balance isn't automatically evidence of inefficiency, but it creates a different question in our mind. What is the optimal size of an emergency reserve? How much should we have? And that question cannot really be answered without a detailed, timely public disclosure. Now let's talk about the new numbers. 2024-2025. Now look at the newly released figures. In financial year 2024-2025, PM Cares total income was reported at around 1279.9 crores. Donations were around 480 crores and the closing balance was approximately 8452.95 crores. Now this distinction is important. 480 crores is not the fund's total wealth and 1279.9 crores is not the closing corpus. The roughly 8453 crore figure represents the accumulated fund balance after accounting for years' inflows and outflows. And this is precisely why audited financial statements matter. They allow citizens to answer where did the money come from, how much was invested, how much interest was earned, how much was spent, where was it spent, and what remains. The newly available accounts therefore improve transparency, but they also raise another question. Why was there a gap in public available annual disclosures after financial year 2022-2023? The important distinction is a delay in publication is not proof of financial wrongdoing. There was just a slight delay of around 2-3 years. But it's not a proof of financial wrongdoing. But for an institution who's handling thousands of crores in donations under the leadership of country's highest constitutional office, timely disclosure should be considered as a basic standard. And it should be considered a basic standard of public trust. See, now this is where PM Cares becomes much bigger. India has several institutions that operate at the intersection of the government, public money, private donations and public purposes. Relief funds, charitable trust, CSR mechanism, political parties, electoral organizations, NGOs, public-private institutions. The common problem is that our laws often classify institutions into neat categories, government or private. But modern governance increasingly exists in the grey zone between the two. PM Cares is a perfect example. Legally, it's a private charitable trust. Functionally, it's a national emergency fund. Leadership is the Prime Minister and the Union Ministers. Funding is private donations. Tax treatment, significant public incentives are there. Purpose, public relief. And this hybrid character is precisely why traditional accountability frameworks can struggle in these kind of trusts or funds which are made. So now the question is, what should the ideal system look like? The answer isn't necessarily to convert PM Cares into a government fund. There may be legitimate reasons for keeping an independent emergency trust outside the budget. There might be some reasons for that. Instead, India could ask for something much simpler. One, timely disclosure. Publish audited accounts every year within a fixed reasonable time framework. That is one demand. Second, expenditure transparency, which means provide project level information on major disbursements. Three is a donation transparency. Provide aggregate donor categories and appropriate disclosure while protecting legitimate donor privacy. And then fourth is independent oversight, whether through a CAG or an independent statutory audit mechanism or another robust framework. The question should be, who independently verifies the money? And then the fifth is outcome audit. Not merely 500 crores was spent, not that, but what did 500 crores achieve? Because financial accountability without performance accountability is actually incomplete. Let me answer this question. That is PM CARES a scam? See, there is no evidence from the audited figures alone that allows us to make such a claim, and it's a very enormous claim to make. But is PM CARES completely transparent? That would also be difficult to argue. And this is precisely why this story matters. The real issue isn't whether India should have an emergency fund. Of course it should. The real issue is what should be the accountability standard for an institution that carries the name of Honorable Prime Minister of India, is chaired by the Prime Minister, raises thousands of crores from citizen corporations, receives tax benefits, and exists for a public purpose. The answer should not depend on which political party is in power, because tomorrow another government may inherit the same institution and the principle should remain the same. Public trust requires public accountability. Not necessarily unlimited disclosure, not necessarily government control, but enough transparency for the citizens to understand where the money came from, where it went, what it achieved, and who independently verified it. PM CARES was born from a genuine national emergency. 6 years later, the emergency has changed, but one important question remains just as important. When citizens give money in the name of a nation, how much should the nation be allowed to know about the money? That is the real PM CARES debate. I hope you gained a new perspective from this session. Do let me know what are your views regarding it in the comment section. All the very best and have a beautiful day. Thank you.